Good evening, friends and fellow travellers. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, online and on radio. This week, I'll be discussing new hate crime laws coming into force next week. Could this be the end of free speech in Scotland? And after UK farmers protested in Westminster this week, I'll be speaking to one of them who says there's a lack of support for UK food production. Plus, plenty of discussion with my panellist, futurist, lawyer and presenter Andrew Eborn. I'm joined this week by barrister, broadcaster and futurist Andrew Eborn. Andrew, do you not just get to the point where you just think, just tell us the reality, which is that you're fed up with us having freedom of speech and rights, and you'd rather just tell us what to do?
I think the reality, Neil, I mean, you're absolutely right, and we're right to be fearing the legislation which has happened. We spoke about it in various territories around the world who are introducing similar legislation. But it's always freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. And the difficulty, as you say, is in the definition. Because whilst everybody's entitled to express or should be entitled to express a view, and indeed there are provisions for that in the legislation, they're saying they're not trying to restrict it. The difficulty is when it does spell out into hate and encouraging people into that sort of side. But the trouble is the definition, and words are so important. They always say sticks and stones will help break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This is absolutely trying to deal with that sort of side.
Isn't the problem, as I have heard it expressed by legal minds, that it's the vagueness and the imprecision of what's in the legislation that's going to leave lawyers and the police kind of throwing their hands up, not knowing what to do?
Yeah, and statements have come out already about the police saying they're going to investigate every allegation. Now, if you're going to do that, it means that certain other crimes are not going to be investigated. And you're right, it opens the potential for abuse of that system, because people who've got a vendetta against a particular view or whatever, they could follow it up with this spurious claim. But there needs to be clear definition for the enforcement officers, for those who need to be properly protected and so on and so forth. And it needs to look at that mischief. I mean, the mischief is if it spills out genuinely into hate, that's wrong. But we must allow a system which encourages opposite views, so question everything and freedom of speech on that basis.
Indeed. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Elon Musk's secretive brain chip company, Neuralink, has begun implanting its devices into human skulls. Neuralink belongs to an upcoming category of medical devices called brain-computer interface that can help people who are paralysed or amputees regain some sense or movements.
It's not allowing signals to be put into the brain as yet. It's recording what the brain's doing. The part of the brain thinks, I want to move that cursor to the left. The signal records that part of the brain. So at the moment, in its very, very early days, I don't think it is open to any significant abuse. But I think you're quite right to be a little bit concerned that in the future, perhaps as the technology improves, and it will improve over the next 4 or 5 years, we need proper controls to make sure that it's not abused by those who might want the wrong purpose behind it.
Now, futurologist Andrew Eborn, I can only imagine that this fills you with a considerable amount of excitement in terms of its potential, but is it a double-edged sword?
Oh, it's definitely a double-edged sword, and I've always professed a musketeer. I love the majority of what Elon does. And as has been pointed out, this has been around for a little while. We had a report last year, in August last year, of Anne, a 30-year-old who, when she was 30, had a stroke, and she'd been paralysed for 18 years. And they managed to do this, put an implant in her brain and managed to get signals that, using avatar created from her wedding video, she could do facial expressions and communicate in a way she hadn't been able to for several years. So really, really exciting on that point of view. But this is the worst it's going to be. It's only going to get better from now on. And so you're right to talk about the other possibilities, to talk about this is telepathy. You can find out what people are thinking on that sort of basis.
How does that sound to you, Mike? You know, the very idea of telepathy, you know, not now, obviously, but in the future, would it be possible that people would be able to share thoughts using a more developed iteration of this technology?
I actually think probably yes. I mean, we're a long way from that. I think people need to worry that technology is around the corner because it's a long, long way away, several decades, I would imagine. But yes, in theory, after all, we thought this technology was exciting 10 years ago. It couldn't be even thought of 10 years ago. So, yeah, things will move, and I think that's why we do need careful control to make sure this technology is properly controlled, properly regulated, and only put in the hands of those who really need it and will benefit from it.
But Andrew, it could be, couldn't it, seen as opening the door to transhumanism, which is that whole other world of exactly what does it mean if we can merge the biological human and the electronic machine.
You're absolutely right. We talked about Steve in the old days of the $6 million man, you might remember. Steve Austin it was. Nowadays it's the $44 billion man with Elon Musk. Those sort of science fiction has become science fact. And I disagree, I think, about the time frame. I think it's going to happen a lot quicker.
Do you think so, Mike Barnes? Do you think actually the whole thing could accelerate quite quickly? Do you think maybe Neuralink are capable of more already than perhaps we know?
I think, well, it's possible. And of course, with Elon Musk's money behind it, that a lot can move quite quickly. And I honestly think that the brain is so complicated. And at the moment, what they've got is actually very simple in terms of just thinking to move a cursor from left to right is actually quite simple compared to all the nuances of human thought. So I do think we are quite a long way away from that becoming anything like reality, to be honest.
But we are, I think it's probably fair to say that we've opened a door into a potential future with lots of ethical and moral considerations and conversations that need to be had. Thank you, Professor Barnes, for that contribution so far this evening. Welcome back once more to the Neil Oliver Show. It's about to become a criminal offence to stir up hatred against certain groups in Scotland. But the laws are controversial, with some commentators saying all of it will serve to stifle free speech. Andrew Eborn.
Yes.
For me, apart from anything else, it is the imprecision that's there in the language of the legislation. I would have thought that something that is the law, going to be the law of the land, would have to give lawyers and the police and everyone else absolute certainty. But the notion that someone just comes to the authorities and says that is hateful.
Yes.
Who makes that decision?
You're absolutely right. There needs to be certainty for all involved, including those enforcing the law. They need to have certainty as to what constitutes this hate speech. It's what I said beforehand is freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. What you need to do is you mustn't stifle freedom of speech. It's essential that we question everything. We encourage other people to express alternative views. What we don't want to do is have the hate speech, which turns into violence and so on and so forth. And I think that's what we need to look at. But when you're having woolly language, what I call woolly language, it makes it difficult for those enforcing it. As you say, you could get a whole catalogue of saying there have been numerous complaints about hate speech against an individual because people have points to score.
Andrew, what it comes down to for me is, when did any government get it in its head that it should be telling the people who pay their wages what to say and even what to think? Hamza Yusuf wants people criminalised for things they say in the privacy of their own home.
Yes, there's that famous T-shirt, isn't it? Think while it's still free to do so. And that's the reality. I mean, you have to have a system where you can basically have those whose views you disagree with, they must have a platform to express those views. That's the whole idea of freedom of speech. And what's going to happen if, on the 1st of April, appropriate date, as you pointed out, we're going to get precedents going to come up. We're going to see what happens with J.K. Rowling and the statements and see whether that's accused of being a hate speech under that new legislation. And this is going to happen. I think it's a very, very dangerous ground we're on at the moment because of the woolliness.
Dangerous ground, Brian Monteith. Just a last word from you. How do you see this developing? Are we just going to see a glut of mischievous cases swamping the courts that already struggle to cope with the workload?
I think there are many people in Scotland who will not be able to contain themselves or show any patience and are likely to submit continual complaints. They probably have them already lined. And it will place immense pressure on the police, who have said they will investigate every complaint, when they're not investigating every burglary, every car theft. It just makes the law look an ass. It makes people think that it's not protecting them and not protecting their property. And it's all being done like student union politics. It's not living in the real world where people actually have to live and work and raise families.
Well, Brian Monteith, speaking for myself, as someone who's aired various opinions about various things in the public domain over the years, I await April Fool's Day with some interest. But Brian Monteith, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, earlier in the week, more than 100 tractors rolled past the Houses of Parliament as farmers protested against what they say is a lack of support for UK food production. Save British Farming, one of the organisers, say cheap food imports and unsupportive policies are putting UK food security at risk.
We want to feed the British people. We don't want to give up our farming. If we give up our farming, what will happen to the countryside?
Yeah.
So, you know.
Andrew, to me this beggars belief.
Yes.
You know, that we could be contemplating a situation where we don't actually grow our own food. I mean, I know it might be a little bit down the line, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but imagine if we're on the on-ramp to a situation where we are just dependent on all of our food coming from elsewhere, just because it's cheap.
I know you're absolutely right, and Liz makes a brilliant point in turning around, and we need to educate people as to what these certain things are, because effectively we're being peddled a lie, if you like. When you're saying you can use the British flag, when, what is it, it's processed or packaged here, and you can still use the British flag, people will think, well, hang on, we must be homegrown. Well, it's not. And that's the reality. The more you can bring the awareness to people on that sort of basis, I think that's helpful.
Liz Webster, I can say unashamedly and unabashedly you have the farmers have my absolute 100% cast iron support, and I will hope you'll stay in touch, because obviously the plight of the British farmers is closest to my heart of all of the farmers around the world. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, a chance to have a longer, more in-depth chat with guests, including George Samueli, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute. He's the co-host of the political commentary show The Gaggle. He'll be giving me his thoughts on the Russian elections, amongst other things. And I'll be joined by Stephen Shaw, the founder of birthgap.org, to discuss whether we are heading for a country of overloaded nursing homes and empty nurseries. All of that in the company of my panellist, lawyer, futurist and broadcaster, Andrew Eborn. Now, it's certainly being said that President Vladimir Putin has tightened his grip on the country that he has ruled since the turn of the century, winning Russia's election by an overwhelming majority in a result that was a foregone conclusion. Putin won just over 87% of the vote on a record turnout of more than 77%. That means Putin will rule until at least 2030, when he'll be 77.
We can't really use standards that we apply to ourselves or to the United States to a very different society, a very different political system that is Russia.
Andrew Eborn, I certainly remember the time, 1989 and onwards, when the fall of the Iron Curtain, when there was a moment when where Russia might have been welcomed back into the fold of Europe. Yes. And I think Russia expected and anticipated that happening. And of course they were just given a stiff arm. And now Russia is held up, especially by the US, but as just the universal bogeyman again. Yeah, it feels like a great tragedy at the heart of Europe.
No, you're absolutely right. And George made a very interesting point. We always assume, because we've seen the news coverage, that everybody who voted for Putin did so under duress. And they talk about sort of people standing armed at the polling stations and so on and so forth. And there is the possibility, people shouldn't dismiss, that they actually voted because they wanted Putin. And you look at that sort of basis, then you might then go into why do they want him, because the propaganda internally and so on and so forth. But it does raise those very, very important questions.
Andrew, I don't think we hear enough. I think it's very interesting to hear of that sense of bafflement and confusion from the Russian side, yes. Russian people looking on at events and just thinking, what on earth is going on? I don't think we hear that often enough.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. It goes back to the central premise that we always talk about. You've got to question everything. You've got to get your news from as many different sources as possible, because somewhere between that lies the truth. And I think that's the problem. We don't get the view on the ground. I mean, what we're told is that a lot of the Russian people are against the war, is what we're told, and that Putin is a dictator and people don't really like him. They're being forced to vote for him. And I think you need to look at that alternative narrative and just sort of say, well, OK, maybe that's the truth.
I could listen to you talk about this and I could hear your perspective on this for the rest of the night, but sadly I'm not able to do that. But I think what a valuable contribution is to hear that reflection on these stories where I feel we've got a very one-sided take on them here at home. George Samueli, thank you very much, and please be a guest again in the future. The US Food and Drug Administration has agreed to delete and never republish several social media posts suggesting that Ivermectin, a drug that some doctors used to treat COVID-19, is for animals and not humans. The FDA tweeted, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow, serious y'all, stop it," and posted a similar message on Instagram.
They have to take down all their social media posts that are along the same lines as that tweet. They also have to take down the misinformation on their website where it's telling patients, it basically said you should not take ivermectin for COVID, which again, they're not allowed to say that. So it's humiliating for them, which is nice, but there's no monetary damages, but we're trying to set a precedent and keep this from happening again.
Bear with me while I read out the statement by the FDA, just to keep everyone square and up to date. The FDA has said that it has chosen to resolve this lawsuit rather than continuing to litigate over statements that are between 2 and nearly 4 years old. The agency added that it has not admitted any violation of law or any wrongdoing, disagrees with the plaintiff's allegation that the agency exceeded its authority in issuing the statements challenged in the lawsuit, and stands by its authority to communicate with the public regarding the products it regulates. The FDA has not changed its position that currently available clinical trial data do not demonstrate that ivermectin is effective against COVID-19. The agency has not authorised or approved ivermectin for use in preventing or treating COVID-19. And also bear with me, Doctor, while I bring in my studio guest, Andrew. How do you react to that? You know, you're a barrister. Yes. You can consider this from a legal perspective, and as just a patient of doctors.
Yes.
How do you feel about the authorities interfering in this way?
Well, it's an incredibly difficult time for doctors. Obviously, they were following government guidance and so on and so forth, and the whole spread of contrary information is very worrying. I mean, the FDA would say that their job is to check at the data and make sure that things are safe and look on that sort of side. But it does make it very, very difficult. And I think, as you said, and they read out in their statement, they're not admitting any liability at all. They don't say they overstepped their mark. And they stand by their views that they think it's unsafe.
But it's a drug with a proven safety record. It's been successfully administered billions of times. It's in the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, and it won the Nobel Prize for medicine, you know, for the people who developed it. And yet the FDA, given all of that, were just automatically saying that it was for deworming horses and a threat to human life.
Yes, and as again, they sort of turn around, they say it's not an admission of guilt. And it's very difficult because you approach it from a consumer's point of view. As a patient, as you say, we're patients on that sort of basis. You hear the very eloquent doctors who are following advice. They're put in impossible situations in what was a horrendous time and trying to find those solutions. And you're getting conflicting advice.
Andrew, it feels to me as if something quite profound has happened, amongst many other profound changes.
Yes.
You know, that relationship of trust, founded on trust, that we have with the medical profession, with pharmaceutical companies, it seems to me fundamentally altered.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I always say trust comes in on foot and leaves on horseback, and never more so in these sort of really diseased information times. And it does make it very difficult. Going back to the point about being a patient, you turn around, you're reliant on your doctors, and then you have these certain people in authority telling you something different. It makes it very, very difficult.
I will hope in future to come back and catch up with how this story progresses. But Dr. Mary Talley-Bowden, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm joined now by Stephen J. Shaw, founder of birthgap.org, to talk about something that absolutely keeps me awake at night. It's about the fact that we have a birth gap deficit. Now, that might sound slightly difficult to comprehend, but we could be facing a time of overloaded nursing homes and empty nurseries. Welcome, Stephen. This really preoccupies my attention, but before we get into the discussion, there's a report in Lancet, I believe. What are the basics of the reality that we face when it comes to the amount of people having babies?
It's hard to, perhaps see around this, but in the UK today, this year, around 900,000 people will celebrate their 50th birthday, but only around 700,000 babies will be born. That's a 23% deficit. Now, that may not sound a lot, but what that means is over a 60-year window, the number of births in the UK will halve, and then half again, and half again. We talk a lot about overpopulation in certain parts of the UK and those perhaps short-term issues, but this has been a long-term trend that's been going on for 50 years, and it's about to catch us up.
Andrew, we often talk, one way or another, we apply the word existential to challenges, but this absolutely is an existential threat that we seem to be sleepwalking into.
Oh, absolutely, and what's going to happen with these seismic advances in medicine, people are going to live longer and longer, and that gap's going to get bigger and bigger as a result. But the economics of the whole thing mean that somebody's got to pay. The younger generation always pay for the old one. And if we don't have that younger generation, we're going to have serious economic problems later on.
Yeah. Oh, it's devastating, both socially and economically. We're entering a new era where, the NHS as we know it today, frankly, will be unsustainable.
Andrew, we also hear, don't we, about immigration will plug the gap. And that's also a reason given for why people should be more open to and tolerant of immigration, because, frankly, someone's got to take up the slack.
Yes, it's exactly that. It's a numbers game, isn't it? We need certain numbers doing certain jobs to make the whole economy work. But it's an interesting thing, going back to your point about statistics, is that are there people who want to have children who can't have children now because of whatever it is, and technology and medicine's advancing to assist that? Or those who just don't want to have children, either because they can't afford it or they don't want children? And then that's a difficulty, isn't it, about how we can force people effectively to start breeding.
I started this project, creating the documentary, really as quite a pessimist, thinking that maybe it is the case that most people just don't want children. But the reality is most people actually do. Right. We're just not very good at educating younger people. We tell them about education, study hard, work hard, get established. We don't really share much about how quickly the fertility window does close on couples. And in terms of immigration, this problem is global. The Lancet report you mentioned is saying that 97% of countries will be in this position by the end of the century. So the number of immigrants available is going to shrink. And, there are all sorts of questions about whether those immigrants will want to come to the UK. There's going to be so much growth in other parts of the world. So just saying it's fine, there's immigration, is a very short-term strategy. I think it's something we need to be focused on ourselves, not some future generation.
It's terrifying. Yes. What you're describing is this slow-motion extinction.
Yes.
And people maybe think, oh, well, he's talking about 100 years or 50 years in the future. That's not really my problem. But it is all of our problem. Everything that our civilization, our presence on the planet is imperiled.
Yes. I mean, 60 years may sound a long time for births to half, but that means by the time someone becomes a grandparent, half the schools, half the kindergartens will have closed. That means an entire community will have been decimated. And this is going to be everywhere. So, people today, especially young people, are going to see this real time in their own lifetime for sure.
But it really is that knock-on effect, isn't it? It's the knock-on effect socially but economically as well, because as people get older, and they are going to be living longer. I was in Cannes very recently talking to the Japanese government. They got me down there to present for them, and they were talking, they're going to have, in Osaka, they're going to have an expo talking about longevity of people. Now they're going to make people live longer and longer and longer. And the difficulty is going to get worse and worse, isn't it? Because if you don't have that stream of people going into the system to basically finance the older people, you're going to have major problems.
Yes, and Japan's confronting that right now. I live in Tokyo, and you can just see it as soon as you go out of central Tokyo, the number of old people who frankly look as though they're living mostly lonely lives, and this lack of children. Right. So
I saw it with my own eyes, a version of something strange, really, in China, where on the street you would see a young couple pushing a buggy with it was always a little boy, and behind them would be coming the grandparents. So that you had all these adults all focusing their attention for the future on this one little prince.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, because of the one child policy, it's still having its reverberations down through the system.
And if you can imagine, in that scenario, that child has no siblings, nor aunts, nor uncles, nor cousins. You know, so really that child is not only...
And no bride, because the
balance
boy,
of
the little
exactly,
boys
you've
so
got the whole thing skewed on that sort of basis.
Is there, as well as, you know, you're talking about people delaying having children, and that isn't just a European thing, that it's, you know, that it's a general Homo sapiens approach to life, but is there also an infertility involved? We used to talk all the time about, you know, too much estrogen in the water and it was affecting, you know, male fertility and so on and so on. Are we less fertile as a species than once we were?
And I'm not an expert in this area, but one thing is for sure, as we delay parenthood into our 30s, it's inevitable that fertility will affect more and more people. And we can see that happening. We can see the large growth in IVF treatments or attempted IVF treatments. This worries me, but I have to say, infertility is not the cause of this problem, because this problem started, low fertility started in the early 70s. And I don't think at that time people were talking about, you know, male challenges as we are today. That may be another effect that worsens things going forwards. But, you know, having children in our 30s has multiple risks, and that's one.
Yeah. Are there, if as it were, there's a league table of challenged populations, you know, who's doing worst? You know, who will check out of the human race first?
Yeah, South Korea. I mean, it's...
Really?
Yes. I mean, it's dire.
What is the birth rate there?
Well, last year it was 0.7. 1/3 of the required babies are being born now. And this year again, it's already treading down. I mean, it means that births in South Korea are halving every 20 years. So the UK is 60. By the time someone comes out of high school, they're already going to be looking at halving the number of kindergartens for that child. By the time they're 40, half again. By the time they're 60, half again.
Sure. So where's the healthiest one then? Where's the healthiest birth rate?
Well, if you look at some countries in Africa, their birth rates are higher, but people would say, you know, that might be a concern for growing populations. The reality is that mothers in sub-Saharan Africa are having one fewer child every 15 years. So Africa's on the same path, but delayed. The healthiest rate might be France right now. They're 1.8. It's still not good.
Because you need to be well over 2 to replace.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. And there really is nowhere. If you want to find some country that either stabilised at 2, that really doesn't exist, or if you want to find a country that went down to the UK's birth rate, which is now 1.5, by the way, it's the lowest ever, 1.49 right now. There's no example of any country in history that we know of that has ever come out of this.
Sure, but the solution then has to be looking at why people are not doing it, and then to incentivise them, if that's the right word, to sort of turn around. If people who say don't delay it because they're over 30, or freeze your eggs, or whatever you need to deal with that sort of side of it.
You know, there's been all sorts of schemes around the world, government policies to try and incentivise births, and with very limited success. What gives me hope is looking into the eyes of younger people, 12 years old to 24 years old, who watched the documentary, and seeing them shocked that they may have a future without children, should they want them, and many, many do. And I can see, I mean, one young woman in Japan watched the documentary and said nothing during a Q&A session, but on the way out whispered to me, "You've changed my life." And that was such a heartening moment. And I assume what she might have meant was that she's going to reprioritise, resequence when she might have a family. So I hope awareness is enough to actually change some minds on this.
Why is it then, this picture that you paint is unremittingly bleak? People like Bill Gates, and I'm just picking him out of a clear blue sky, really, talk about overpopulation. You know, we're still banging on that Paul Ehrlich population bomb thing about, this time next year, you know, they'll be standing room only on the high street. Why are we still being told that there are too many Homo sapiens on Earth?
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of people have a lot of answers to give on why they're still saying that. I mean, Paul Ehrlich is now in his 90s, still saying the same thing as he was saying in the 1960s about overpopulation. And some people will be pleased that we're going to potentially head down through all of these challenging decades to a lower population number. My view is we at least need to be aware of it. We need to know what the challenges are, because there will be big challenges for young and old, and that those people who want to have children should be educated to at least know what the chances are at different times of their life.
But surely there must be a stage, because people are living longer, as we say. There will be a time when the population increases while they live longer, until you reach that ceiling, and then the bits which are feeding into the system are not going through.
Well, that's what's happening right now. The world's population at 8 billion is going to go up to 10 or 11.
Right.
And the only reason is that people are living longer. Yes. The total number of births on the planet peaked in 2013, I think it was. We're already down about 5% below that already. So total births are already on the way down. No one knows that, mostly. But we are continuing to grow only for a short time whilst people live out their lives, and that's a good thing.
It seems extraordinary to me that a handful of academics operating in the late 60s and in the 70s might have actually sounded the death knell for the species.
Yeah.
You know, by with their Malthusian attitudes to the species. And doing their their mathematical modelling, they've got that wrong, and a handful of academics may have doomed us to extinction.
Yeah, and I think they may have assumed, I know some certainly did, that birth rates will go back up of their own volition. Like, I think in China, the assumption was after they stopped the one-child policy about 8 years ago now, you're not going to have any number of children in China, that birth rates would go back up. And it's done the opposite in China. So I think there's been a lot of so-called smart people who have got this widely wrong in terms of once you create a societal norm of high levels of childlessness, it's very difficult to reverse.
It's extraordinary. You know, overpopulation is the drum that powerful, rich people with platforms just keep on banging, and on the contrary, what you are making us aware of is something else entirely. Stephen J. Shaw, thank you so much. I've got no comfort from this whatsoever. I will continue to have sleepless nights, but thank you for doing what you can to bring this to everyone's attention. You have been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Bev Turner will be with you next week while I am elsewhere, and I'll be back after that.